Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 76 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's commentary and reading starts at Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18, through Deuteronomy chapter 20. Now, there's a lot of chapters covered today, aren't there? A lot of this is really revisiting some of the laws laid out in Leviticus and Numbers, and I've even covered some of this in my commentary previously. This gives us a little bit more details, but also remember Moses is laying this out as a foundation for now, in many cases, the descendants of those who first heard these laws for themselves. And some of the ones who are alive would have been children at that time, so it's just reinforcing those. But it is also giving a little bit more detail to them. I wanted to start out with verse 1 of chapter 17. He says, "You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep which has a blemish or any defect, for that is a detestable thing to the Lord your God." This, in many ways, goes back to what I was addressing yesterday with the heresy in this children's book. And the heresy in the children's book, and if you didn't see that video, I'd encourage you to go back and watch that one. The heresy there is when Jesus is going down to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. And when John asked him, why did he come to the river? Jesus says, to have my sins washed away. Well, now, such a heresy for sure. Because God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, right? Or let me read this verse. This is out of 1 John chapter 3, verse 5. It says, "You know that he appeared in order to take away sins. In him there is no sin." So our Messiah was perfect, without blemish. All of the sacrifices of the old covenant scriptures, the temple sacrifices, tabernacle sacrifices, they're to point us to the Messiah. They are to show us that Jesus would be without sin, without blemish, without defect. And so, again, this is a picture of when Satan is tempting Jesus and he takes him up to the pinnacle of the temple, tells him, cast himself down, that don't you know that the angels will bear you up so that not a bone of your body will be broken. Or you think of on the day of the crucifixion as the Roman soldiers are going around breaking the legs of the two criminals to either side of Christ, and then when they come to Christ they find he's already dead. They of course are breaking the legs of each of the ones who have been crucified so that they will go ahead and die. But when they get to Christ and find that he's dead, well, they don't need to break his legs. So, I have to go through that whole teaching. We're going to get there in time. But I think you understand that the picture of that is that God was preserving, God was protecting. So we're going to see this without blemish, without sin from Christ. Israel does have a time in their history, which we'll read of later, when some of the people are saying, oh, I'm going to take my sickly sheep, or I'm going to take my sickly goat. I'm not going to take the best of my animals. And they're bringing the animals which do not meet God's standards. And things don't go well for the nation at that time either. It's so sad that the Lord lays it all clearly before us, and we keep wandering away. It's heartbreaking, really. In verse 14 of chapter 17, he says, "When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, you shall say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations who are around me. Then you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen, you shall set as a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. So much to say here. First off, this is not God's choice. It says the people are going to say this, but he is going to be the one to choose or direct the people towards that one to be the king. So we're going to see this happen. And I believe that it almost happens. The Lord knows when it's going to happen. But I believe that if the people had waited on the Lord, we know that Jesse was the one who the rod would not depart from, that basically is prophesied by Jacob. And we're going to actually look at another one of Jacob's blessings over another son in a minute. But blessed that the line of Jesse, or Judah, the line of Judah would be the one to carry forth that kingly or kingship. The first king of Israel, though, comes from the tribe of Benjamin. So, again, the people are going to cry out for a king, but listen to what he says. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves, but not a foreigner. So it's sort of like our own country. You can't be a foreigner and become president of the United States. You have to be a natural born citizen of the country. And again, I think you would see the logic here. You can't have somebody that would have another allegiance running your country, because all of a sudden you'll end up with a foreign army running your country, and all of a sudden you've lost your country. So the Lord knows what people like. You can have a smooth talker, somebody that looks good, somebody that's head and shoulders above everybody else. They're like, this is our king. He looks kingly. And then you lose your country. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said, you shall never again return that way. Well, one, this is because Egypt had the best horses at that time. The other is God doesn't want the king or the army of Israel to build up a large cavalry unit, because then the victories in battle, they would say, look at what we did, look at how great our horses are, we have magnificent cavalry and great generals. The victory was supposed to come from God. Even though they were going to go into the battle, the victory was supposed to come from God. We're going to look at a couple of verses about that again in a little bit. So they're not to multiply the horses. The third king of Israel did exactly that. He pretty much violates everything here that God says not to do. So he says, you shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greedily increase silver and gold for himself. Three things that Solomon does. He ends up with one of the largest cavalry units that any military had had. Almost the valley of Megiddo at that time had large stables which he had all of these horses kept in. He, of course, takes on a multitude of wives, not to mention his concubines and then just acquaintances, basically. And they do what? They lead his heart astray to worship the false demon gods of the other nations. And then when you think of Solomon, you think of all of his gold. You think of how he had all this wealth. And that, we're going to see later, is so pointed out of how wealthy Solomon was. But God says that the king wasn't supposed to do that. So he violates directly those three things. So chapter 18 is going to lay out for us the Levitical or the Levites area, the cities that they're going to be given. But yet they don't really possess those cities. And it says that they are not going to have an inheritance for themselves because the Lord is their inheritance. And I said I wanted to look at a passage where Jacob or Israel, is giving the blessings to his sons. And we find this very thing spoken over the tribe of Levi, or actually Levi himself, where it says in chapter 49, verse 7, "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce." And this is speaking of when Simon and Levi went throughout the city and slew all of the men in that city. So this is a reference to that. And it says, "And their wrath, for it is cruel." Remember, the men had been circumcised in Shechem, and now they go in on the third day and kill all of those men. He says, "I will disperse them in Jacob, I will scatter them in Israel." The Levites are spread all over Israel. Now, yes, they were the priest, and in one sense it was a good thing they were scattered, but they did not have a direct inheritance of the land. So I just think it's interesting how that passage, he's going to scatter them, and that's exactly what happens. They end up being scattered all over the nation. And how much more, really, when we later think of, as we get into the New Covenant Scripture, New Testament Scriptures, and we think of how the Levites or how the Pharisees and the Sadducees are, they really should have been the ones to understand grace and the grace of God almost more than anyone else. Here, their whole tribe was known for this murder that they had committed centuries before. They were the ones who, or at least the high priest Aaron, is the one who built the golden calf for the people, and they experienced such grace and mercy and forgiveness from the Lord. How much more should they have shown that to others? But they did not. In chapter 20, I wanted to end with this. As I had mentioned, the Lord will fight the battles. Don't be afraid of the battles that you're in. And I'm not necessarily meaning a physical battle. Sometimes it's a spiritual battle. But take heart in these words that are about to be shared. Chapter 20, verse 1. "When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. He shall say to them, 'Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted. Do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies and to save you.'" Do not be afraid. God goes with you, or even before you. And He is there to fight that battle. Trust in Him. Do not be afraid. We're going to see, and I mentioned this a little bit the other day as well, with King Jehoshaphat. That is always the most exciting part to me, is when the battle is fought by the people just going forth and singing. And confusion. The Lord brings confusion in the enemy's camp, and they kill each other. When you're in turmoil in your life, start singing praises to Him. Lift up God's name. Let Him go before you to fight that battle for you. Do not be terrified of the enemy that's in front of you. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.